Good morning. We've come down to the better end of this series. This will be our last lesson in the series. We'll wrap this book up, sort of. I always feel like when you do 12 weeks on Hebrews, there's a lot that you leave undone. But that's okay, because that just means that you'll want more of it. My philosophy is always leave them wanting more. Don't leave them wanting you to go quicker. So that's what we'll do in this series. I do want to thank Ben for filling in for me last week. That allowed me to go back to West Virginia and do Thanksgiving with my family. And I've heard good things about that lesson. We were hurrying, though, all weekend, I just have to say. So we'll have to read that book in our family. So as we come down to the end of this book, we're going to look at allow the end of chapter 12, the ending section, which would pick up in verse 18, bring us into the weirdest part of the book, which is chapter 13. Chapter 13, by the time we get there, it appears that it's a letter. For the first time in the book, it appears that it's actually a letter. Seems a lot like things that Paul would say in his letters. I think mostly of like First Thessalonians. He kind of, to me, he gets to the end of that letter and just starts bam, 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 bam. You need this, do this, do this, do this. That's kind of the way Hebrews is going to end. And then he sneaks in, kind of in the middle of chapter 13, a very interesting section that reminds us that we're still in the book of Hebrews. But when you get to chapter 12, verse 18, you're beginning, he's winding down the argument of the book. So by the time you get to verse 29, the rhetorical aim of the book has come through. And then in chapter 13, it's the main practical section of the book that ends in a couple of ways. One with a benediction that we cannot overlook. And then some greetings. That would happen in a letter. So you get all the way to the end and surprise us. Hey, this is a letter. But it's a sermon, you remember. And it is a sermon, and we know it's a sermon, and the guy who's writing it says it's a sermon because in verse 22, he says, I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation. And we noticed early on in this series that really is technical language for what was a synagogue sermon. And there's much about this that appears to be a really good synagogue sermon. But as we enter into this section, we want to kind of process where we've been in this book. And it's important to ask the question again, what's the big challenge? What's confronting them that leads this preacher to send them this sermon? What's the big challenge?
They're being persecuted and their properties being taken away, and the it's to give up.
Okay. Yeah, and for them, first it's important to identify who these people are. Well, obviously they're Christians, but what else do we know about them, about their heritage and their background? Well, what's the book called? Hebrews. So they have a Jewish background. So their temptation is not as we might see it. If we gave up on Christ, I think we would very clearly believe we probably walked away from God, right? But not for them. Why not? What out do they see themselves having that we might not see ourselves as having? There wouldn't be a total abandonment of God.
God's chosen people.
All right, we're still Jews. So maybe we can quit going on Sunday morning, but we still can go, and I don't know if they went maybe on Friday evening after sundown. is probably when they went to synagogue, which is a good time to do it. Get it out of the way so that we can go home and eat. No, wait, I'm thinking of Sunday, isn't it? That's what everybody's going to be thinking, Monty. I always felt that when I was preaching. Somebody is thinking, would he hurry up so we can go eat? But I imagine they did that on Friday evening too. But that's their big temptation is, yeah, we're not really turning away from God, but we can just kind of drift back into our Jewishness and be Jews. It's important you see that. Second question, though, is what reasons does the preacher give them to stand firm in this struggle and, very importantly, hold on to Jesus? Now, this is the whole book. So what are some things he said? And here's a key word for you in case you've missed it. Better. How is Jesus better than simply being Jews? He's a better high priest. That's a big part of this book. That language is coming back in chapter 13, by the way. Yeah. So what's that matter?
He has been able to take away sins for all time rather than just annually.
All right. More effective sacrifice. Yeah. And what did he sacrifice? Himself. A better sacrifice in terms of it fits a person for a person rather than a bull or a goat for a person. Okay, all these are great things. Yes?
We have a better life through Jesus' sacrifice, which we would not have had without his sacrifice.
Right. I think of him being able to cleanse us to the deepest part of us, to cleanse our conscience. It's an important one. Yes. What else we got?
High priest that understands us intently from all that he suffered, being tempted in every way.
Yes. Important word in the book is we have a high priest. We don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us. Do you remember the idea of that word sympathize? That's one of my favorite parts in this book. That Jesus is able to feel together with us. Isn't that a wonderful thought? Yes, very important, very important.
We have a better reward. We have heaven. And he continually reminded them of that better reward, that this life was going to be short, but that one would be eternal and it would be better than they could ever think of.
Yes. And you better believe he's coming back to that at the end of this book. And remember, he says that in so many ways throughout Hebrews. But we'll see the one he hammers in on. I would give you one more word, and this ties into what you're saying. But we actually have a better hope. And what is our hope based upon? Well, it's based on Jesus. But what about Jesus makes our hope a certain hope?
He gives us.
Well, the grace he gives us. That's right. He's able to save to the uttermost. Another really powerful line in this book. He says it only in a few ways. How about this one? He ever lives to make intercession for us. But in chapter 11, as he talked about these great people of faith who did not receive what was promised, he talked about those who received their loved ones through resurrection from the dead. Keep that in mind. He hasn't talked a lot about it. He hasn't very clearly said it at all in this book, but he is going to come back to that idea. And that is really what secures a better hope for us. So keep that in mind as we go through. But what he's really calling these people to is to a faithful pilgrimage. He's reminded them a few times that they really are strangers and exiles in this place. They're not supposed to fit in. That's part of the problem right now. Some of the persecution, he said they've not yet resisted to the point of shedding their blood, but there's a lot of ridicule and being set aside and pushed aside and looked at as being different, which is the reason for the persecution. If you remember, perhaps the historical basis of this book is that Nero needed somebody to blame the great fire on that maybe he started. And there was nobody better than the weirdos, the Christians. So they were on the outside. And that feeling of being outsiders is really a legit feeling. You don't want to feel that way, right? But for them, it's legit. They aren't made for this place. He goes on and he's talking about the people of faith in particular. Moses, who did not want to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, but he was willing to bear, and he says, the reproach of Christ. He was an outsider, though he was thoroughly an insider at that point. He chose to be an outsider. Abraham was an outsider. He never found his homeland. He was still looking for the city that God has prepared for him. So this being pilgrims is the way they should view themselves. And when you view yourself as a stranger and an exile, you're not surprised by the treatment. And perhaps maybe that's one of our struggles today. I don't know that we feel that the way we should. Now, our society is helping us out. Maybe we should be grateful for that. I don't know. But we used to sing many years ago, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through." But it seems to me that we've made this place so much our home that when things start to change and when we feel a little aggression toward Christianity, that we're really upset about it. But that's because we haven't been feeling like strangers and exiles. But that's what we are. We don't belong here. This is not our home. And that's what he's going to hone in on as he winds up this book. Who are you? Well, let's read together, beginning in verse 18 of chapter 12. And I'm just for now going to read through the end of the chapter. "For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, 'I tremble with fear.' But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, 'Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens.'" This phrase, "yet once more," indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. "Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire." Before we touch on exactly what he's saying here, I would like to talk about the Platters and Belinda Carlisle for a moment. Now, the Platters, I picked that one for some of you who that might be more applicable than Belinda Carlisle. And then there are those of you who are saying, who? On both. But I'm not that old. You should know my people. Belinda Carlisle, her song, "Heaven is a Place on Earth," came out. The single was released in 1987. Belinda Carlisle, for those of you who may even Maybe that's a little past your generation. You might remember the girl group, the Go-Go's. Well, she was a part of that group. Vacation, that's one of the songs. Anyway, a much better song was in 1956 by the Platters. My granny loved the Platters, and my mom loved the Platters, and my younger brother and I loved to listen to the Platters. So we grew up listening to all this old stuff, but it began with my granny who loved the Platters. But their song was Heaven on Earth. Both songs are essentially saying that this romantic love that we have is heaven on earth. Or in Belinda Carlisle's song, because we have this amazing romantic love, that wherever we are, we're going to make this heaven on earth. The writer of the Hebrews is talking about heaven on earth, but it has nothing to do with romantic love. So the Platters got it wrong. Belinda Carlisle, not surprisingly, got it wrong. The Platters had more of a chance, in my opinion. But the writer to the Hebrews, he says there's something else that's heaven on earth. It's easy to miss, but he's talking about the church here. Notice what he says in verse 22. But you have come. You've already come to Mount Zion. What's Mount Zion? And to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You've already come to the place where you're going. Now that's strange. But there's a lot of this now and not yet that is true in Jesus Christ. That there is an experience we have now. It might not be the full experience, but it is the experience. It's more than just a taste of the experience. It is something of the experience, though it's not the complete experience. And while heaven is our reward, heaven is the ultimate destination for our pilgrimage, there is a sense in which, as the people of God in the church of Jesus Christ, we have arrived at Mount Zion. We have arrived at the city of God. And that's what he does, is he talks about these two mountains. One is Mount Sinai. If you go back and read about the Israelites being at Sinai, you see all these terrifying things that are happening. But that was the end, in some ways, of their pilgrimage out of the land of Egypt. That's where they came to. They came to Sinai. But on Sinai, the only thing that they realized at Sinai is that Jehovah God is awesome and terrifying. That's what they learned at Sinai. He's not getting into all the depths of was Sinai good or bad. That's not his point here. Don't read too much into it. What he's making the contrast is what you learned in Judaism essentially was terrifying. Paul would say it this way: the law came in to show the sinfulness of sin. What was received on Sinai? Yeah, the law. The law. And what you learned about God and you from the law is that God is holy and awesome, and you are not. The law was never really meant to be a satisfying end. The pilgrimage of the Exodus, there was a stop at Sinai, but it wasn't the end. In fact, when they moved in and took possession of the promised land, that wasn't the end of the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage actually started east of Eden. East of Eden. That's the way they got kicked out, remember? Because there was the flaming sword and the cherubim on the east of Eden. Now, Steinbeck ripped that off, but that's an interesting book, by the way. I like that book. The pilgrimage started east of Eden, and it's continued. There was a stop at Sinai. We had to learn something very important at Sinai, but that's not where it ends. You have come to Mount Zion. Notice the differences. That Sinai was touchable. Oh, you could touch it. It was of this creation, but not without consequences. If even a beast touched it, what was supposed to happen to the beast? It would be stoned. It was terrifying. Moses said, I tremble with fear. And it was something that could be shaken. But then as he talks about Zion, he says something very different about it. It's weird because later on he'll say, the things that are shaken are things that have been made. He's talking about things of this creation. But that the kingdom that we have, the mountain that we've come to, cannot be shaken. So it's vastly different, but it's inhabitable. Because he says you've come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God. Why do you have a city? It's where people live. It's inhabitable. Notice he talks about these angels, innumerable myriads of angels are here. Now, there's a textual variant here. I believe the reading should include this idea of a festal gathering. So these angels are in festal gathering, or your NIV says joyful, as opposed to terrifying. This place is a place of joy and rejoicing. Having these great assemblies, a festal gathering is reminiscent a little bit of the feasts and festivals of the Jews. A lot of rejoicing in those festivals. But it's actually also supposed to be reminiscent or remind us, because we've already come, of our worship here. We've already come to Mount Zion. We've already come to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem. We're already tasting, experiencing something wonderful about this. So this Zion is an interesting reference. This mountain is a combination of church and heaven, but maybe it's really that the church spills over into heaven. When we're talking about the church, we're talking about the people of God. We've already come to the people of God. That is a very strong statement that he's making to people who've identified themselves before they ever knew Jesus as the people of God. But there's a sense in which the true people of God are the people of Jesus Christ. He says in verse 24 that you've come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Hey, now we remember we've been in Hebrews. We've been all over this whole sprinkled blood of Jesus, new covenant. That's chapters 8 and 9 and 10. This big discussion. So we've come to Jesus. So when you come to Mount Zion, even among the Jews, was always thought of the place where God is. That's where God's throne is, Mount Zion. But who's there? How do you get there? Through Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. So he presents these two mountains. And then as he transitions away from the mountain idea, though he comes back to the things that cannot be shaken. I believe he's still talking about this experience of Zion, the city of God, the heavenly Jerusalem. He offers a warning again. One of the important things about Hebrews and the way the preacher goes about the message is he combines two very important things. There are so many uplifting, powerful promises that we have in Jesus Christ. I mean, he is constantly lifting us up as to how good we have it in Jesus. And those are the reasons you don't want to walk away from. How can you walk away from Jesus? It's part of what he's doing in this book. But there's another side to that. The fact is, some people will walk away from Jesus. No matter all these wonderful blessings that you have in Jesus, there's still some people who, knowing those blessings, will still turn and walk away from Jesus. What then? So we also have in this book some of the more frightening warnings. So we had this way back in chapter 2. We must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Then his main point, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? How shall we escape? Escape what? He tells you here in chapter 12 who God is. Verse 23, and to God, the judge of all. Then in verse 25, bringing us back to this important warning, see that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape, there's our word again, when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less, notice how this language is very similar to what we read in chapter 2, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. They ignored Moses and had to suffer the consequences. Now, Moses was speaking for God, but Moses is not Jesus. Jesus is speaking from heaven. Jesus is greater than Moses. If you had to endure the consequences of rejecting the word of Moses, how much more do you think you will have to endure the consequences of rejecting the word of the Son of God? It's important in our age where we often want a very uplifting, positive experience with God, that we're honest enough to hear the warnings. Because if you reject the greatest gift that God has given, don't you think you should have to bear the consequences of that refusal? Yes. Yes, you should. Makes sense. Not the easiest things to listen to, but they're realistic. You know, why do people have such a problem with the judgment of God? We're pretty good at judging too. Oh, maybe I should speak for myself. I'm pretty good at judging too. You mistreat my family, I'm pretty good at judging. You mistreat me, I'm pretty good at judging. If I've been exceptionally good to you, not many of those people exist on this planet, but if I've been exceptionally good to you and you slap me in the face, I'm going to make judgments in my mind about you, and I may even verbalize them. Judgment is real. It's a real aspect of life, isn't it? If you break the law, what do we expect is going to happen? More people should expect that if they break the law, they should have to experience the consequences. That might help us out a little bit more. It's just that's justice. We understand justice. But here's the beauty of God. God has given us every way to be set free from the sins that we have committed. Forever free from them. God's given us every reason not to experience his condemnation and wrath. Every single reason possible. Which is why we should listen to the warnings. If he's gone to that extent, it makes sense that we will not escape if we refuse the one who's been so gracious to us. So then he begins, I believe he's kind of transitioning in verse 26. By the way, there's one of those therefore phrases, very important, right? Let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom. Another exhortation, let us offer to God acceptable worship. I want to talk about that word in just a moment. Then as he lays out all these different, just a bunch of different commands on what you should do, what you should not do. I believe what he's doing is giving us some keys to a successful pilgrimage. How can we make it? Because we've arrived, strangely enough, though, we're not home yet. We've arrived, but we're not home yet. How do we make it home? So the first key actually begins to be laid out in verse 28. Let us be grateful. Let us offer to God acceptable worship. So this word worship is this word that we've seen all throughout this book. It's the word for a priestly service. So let us offer priestly service to God. And this service must be offered from gratitude to God for what he has done. Well, then in verses 15 and 16, he takes this language of priest and temple and service, and he uses the word sacrifice. What did the priests do? They offered sacrifices. Now, we're skipping over the atonement sacrifice for a moment, though he does talk about it in verses 11 and 12. But that's not our deal. We don't offer a sacrifice of atonement. That's not our priestly service. Jesus did that once for all time, right? Yeah. What is our priestly service? It's more on the lines of offering what we would call a fellowship offering or a thanksgiving offering. It's an offering, first of all, that responds to the goodness of God to say, thank you. Really relevant at this time, huh? But it's also the way that you say thank you to God is by giving yourself over to do what God would have you to do. Thanksgiving's not simply about words. It's about offering. So notice what he says in verse 15. There are words. Through him then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Now that was in the literature of the intertestamental period. So especially I'm thinking of, I believe it's like the Psalms of Solomon, Wisdom of Solomon. In those books, there is this connection where they talk about the thanksgiving offering, and they use this very specific language about offering the fruit of the lips. But this fruit of the lips, it is praise, but maybe not praise the way we think it's praise. It's praising by dedicating oneself to God. That's what one did in that offering. So that's what he's talking about here. Let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise. Let us continually, he would say it in chapter 10, hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Let us continually say that we belong to Jesus and we're going to live for Jesus. But then in verse 16, where again he uses this language of sacrifice, he says, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. The other place in the New Testament where this language of sacrifice is applied to the Christian life and launches into a big section of application is in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapters 1 through 11, he's laid down all of these glorious doctrinal truths about Christ and what Christ has accomplished for us. He gets to chapter 12 and he says, okay, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Our response is to live for God no matter what. So, verse 16 is very important. What's happening to these people? We've talked about this. Let's remember. What's happening to these folks?
They're being persecuted, their properties are being taken away, their possessions are being taken away.
Yeah. Perhaps some are already being imprisoned. So all this is happening in your community. What's my role in this? Be so much afraid that I can't do what God wants me to do. No. Even in the middle of those threats and the possibility, it could be you. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have. That does sound like a sacrifice to me. If life is great and I'm just, prospering beyond all imagination, I have so much that I give it away, it doesn't even bother me. I don't even feel it. Life is good. I love it. I want to share and be generous. But what about when life isn't good? What about when you're not sure if they're going to come and take your stuff next or take you? How do you live then? Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. What he's doing in this section, I think that's the verse that kind of clues us into what he's doing with all of these things, is he is preparing this community to face suffering faithfully. So go back to the beginning of chapter 1. Don't turn on each other. Why would there be a temptation to turn on people in your church when persecution is coming? Yeah, if I can maybe save my skin, I may point them in your direction. That's not brotherly love. Brotherly love is this idea of I'm committed to you. Let brotherly love continue. Verse 2 and 3, I believe, have some connection to each other. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. Now, before you run off and want to get into a discussion about the whole angel thing, just stop and listen to what he says to do. That's more important. Because we can debate all day about what does this angel thing mean? And we could go back and watch Touched by an Angel, the whole series, and be uplifted about the angels. But listen to what he says to do. Show hospitality. When people are displaced because they've confiscated their homes, what do they need? They need a home. There are Christians all over this city. They don't all know each other. There are Christians all over our city. Do you know all of them? I don't know everybody who comes to church here yet. There may be a stranger who is a brother whose home has been confiscated and he needs a place to stay. You don't neglect to show hospitality. Number 3, you see how he's preparing them to deal with life in this situation. Remember those who are in prison. By the way, this hospitality has to extend to those who are in prison. There was nobody, no government paying for the food that the person in prison was going to eat. They depended upon the generosity of their family. What if they didn't have family? At least in the physical, fleshly sense. Who are they dependent on? They're dependent on the Christian family. So remember those who are in prison. Now here's something interesting too, where he comes in with verse 4. I haven't figured this one out. I mean, I know what he's saying. I know what he's telling you not to do. I don't understand why it's necessarily in the middle of these. But let marriage be held in honor among all. Let bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous. I get verse 5, why it's here. Keep your life free from love of money. Money, just read that as stuff. Wealth, whatever you got. Why is that important here? Well, you might have it today, but they might come and take it tomorrow. Then what do you have? What do you have? Oh, one of the powerful verses, the powerful promise of God all throughout Scripture to his people who will be faithful to him. I will never leave you nor forsake you. When they take everything you have, you still have it all because you have God. See how he's preparing this community for what's ahead, for what's coming up on this trek of their pilgrimage, and it's not nice. It's not nice. I would say it this way, that while we need to have gracious and reverent priestly worship to God, and some of these things even fit into that, there's also this idea that we need to have appropriate relationships. That appropriate relationships, not just relationships with each other, and I think perhaps that's part of why verse 4 is in there, but relationships, verse 5, relationships with our money. Our stuff. Our stuff is one of those things that has the power to really connect us to this place. Old song, covet not this world's vain riches. You know that, hold to God's unchanging hand is the song. But I love that line, covet not this world's vain riches. It's not going to last. But that kind of is what ties us down. Have a good relationship with your stuff. Verse 7, have a good relationship with your leaders. Sometimes that, as he will later say, is obey your leaders and submit to them. They're trying to help you. But some of that is don't forget them. Remember how they lived before you. Remember how they held on to their faith to the very end. Who is probably going to be some of the first people to be persecuted to the point of death in this community? It's going to be the people at the forefront. It's going to be the leaders. Yeah, you want to be a leader? Hey, guess what comes with it? People will know you first. They'll come after you first. You remember them. Remember their way of life. Remember their faithfulness. And then he talks about Jesus Christ being unchanging. One of the great lines that people remember from Hebrews. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Jesus is faithful. Verse 9 is important. As we talk about faithfulness, do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings. What are these teachings? He doesn't elaborate. Although he does talk about foods. What's he talking? I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about there. Scholars debate it because they don't know either. That's why you debate. And then he starts this strange language of verse 10. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. This is a crazy transition. He's talking about the animals that were offered for the sacrifice of atonement. So he comes back to that idea, the sacrifice of atonement. Well, who offered the sacrifice of atonement? So the priest would take those animals outside the camp and burn them. There are other things outside the camp too. Lepers had to live outside the camp. So not great things happened outside the camp. Outside the camp is where they would put people to death for violating the law. All those things happened outside the camp. But who's outside the camp, he says? This is an interesting play on all those ideas where Jesus is the one offering the sacrifice of atonement. So by virtue of that, he has to go outside the camp. But Jesus is the one who's bearing the sin of the world. So Jesus has to go outside the camp. And Jesus is the one being executed, not because he was, but as a criminal. And so Jesus has to go outside the camp. It's kind of strange argumentation here. But look at verse 13. Underline it. I think this is the heart of the book, of what it means for me and you to follow Jesus. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp. Why? To bear the reproach he endured. Oh. You want a successful pilgrimage? You have to stick with Jesus. Sometimes that means you give up the pleasures of sin. You give up the right of being an insider in this world. And you go outside the camp. And like Moses, you bear the reproach of Christ. He ends it up with prayer. I want to leave with the benediction and then we'll be done. Now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, equip you with everything good, that you may do his will, working in us, or working in you, that which is pleasing in his sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. God will take care of you. He will provide for you. You can be faithful and do his will, even if it requires bearing the reproach of Christ. Because we have a city. We have a city. And it is a lasting city. It is a kingdom that cannot be shaken. The kingdoms of this world, they'll be shaken. Rome, already been shaken. Any kingdom that opposes the people of God will be shaken to ruin. But we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken. So let's just keep serving God and praising God and rejoicing in all the good things that God has given us in Jesus Christ.